Hey everyone, it's Austin Solomon, the Solomon Group, coming to you live with this week's episode of the Real Wausau Real Estate Show. Today we're talking about prorations. So proration, the definition is to distribute or to allocate something. So when it comes to real estate, it's not a fun topic, but it gets mixed up so much, and it's kind of, it's a new topic for a lot of people, so I just thought I'd debunk what it is and how it affects the real estate space. So when you own a home, you have a lot of reoccurring bills like property taxes, utilities, maybe you have an LP tank if you're out in the country, maybe you have fuel oil. If you have a condo, there's a HOA fee, or if it's a rental, there's rent and security deposits. There's all these things that need to be divvied up and accounted for when closing on a property. So how do all those things get squared away at closing? Well, it can be a little bit tricky, especially when you have all the different billing cycles for each of those things. So for for example, a city water sewer bill in our areas typically comes out every quarter, every 3 months. Or taxes, taxes are what we call they're paid in arrears, which means 2018's taxes are due in the first part of 2019. And then you have like LP. Well, those prices are changing on the daily, so that adds another variable. But that's where the title company comes in to prorate or distribute the proper amount of dollars to each category to the buyer and seller. So that effectively the buyer is, you'd say, starting fresh when they close on a home. So what do I mean by this? So let's say that we're going to use June 30th as a closing date. So that's halfway through the year. And if you have, taxes that are, let's say that June 30th is the closing date, and let's say the taxes are $1,200 a year, right? So that would be, so basically the seller would be responsible for the first half of the year's taxes while they own the property. So 6 months of taxes would be, in our case, if the taxes are $1,200, 6 months, $600. So the seller would, if the closing occurred on June 30th, the seller would credit the buyer that $600, and then the buyer would be responsible for the full amount of the taxes when it comes due at the end of the year. Okay, so the whole goal of prorations is so that when the seller signs and closes on the house, the seller can walk away not having to worry about any more bills, any more taxes, utilities, anything from the property. Everything is settled at the closing, and now any bills or things that come up down the line would be the buyer's responsibility. Okay, so let's talk about utilities, right? So again, June 30th, that's right when the second, if it's at the end of the month, it actually might make things a little bit easier for you. So the utility bill, if that bill doesn't come out, in time, for example, then what they would do is they'd use that previous bill, which would be from quarter one. So this is like water sewer bill. They would use they'd use the next best thing. So it could be a previous bill. If the current bill did come out, they might just have the seller pay that in that example. But if it didn't come out, what they would do is they'd say, hey, you're going to credit the buyer, X amount of days. And in our case, it might be like 89, 90 days worth of water and sewer based on the previous bill. And then when that new bill comes out, the buyer's going to be responsible for that. Okay. So like on June, let's say it's a June 1st closing, right? There'd be 2 months of utilities that would be due, and they would use that previous bill. So if it's $100, they'd say, okay, well, you got 2 months of $100 bill, and it comes out every 3 months. That'd be like $66 that you would give the buyer at closing, and then a month later, when that actual bill comes due, the buyer's responsible for it. So, then there's things that are prorated on the monthly. Could be like a rent amount, and that's pretty easy, right? So if you close on the 15th day of the month, and there's a rent payment that's, $1,000 a month, and you have to prorate that rent, then the buyer, the seller would hold on to, if the seller were to collect the rent before the closing, the seller would hold on to half of that, or $500, and then the other half would go to the buyer. So that's what prorations are. And then there's like LP and fuel oil, and that involves, hey, at the time of closing, how much fuel is left in the tank, and the buyer would reimburse the seller for the amount of fuel that's in the tank. So for example, an LP tank, let's say there's 100 gallons and the current price of fuel is 100 gallons. Then at closing, the buyer would give the seller a check. Hey, here's $100 for the fuel that's left in your tank. Done, right? Now for WPS, or Wisconsin Public Service, or your electric and your gas, that's a little bit different. WPS requires the buyer and the seller to call to switch that over, and there's actually no proration involved there. What they do is they'll just, if it's closing on X day, they will just do a meter read and send out 2 bills and start it fresh for the buyer. So that works out pretty nice too. So that's what prorations are. When you're selling a house and when you're buying, if you understand this, it might just make things a little bit easier come closing day and transferring everything into your name. So thanks for listening to this week's episode of The Real, and we'll catch you guys on next week's show.